Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a much debated issue for decades, so long that sometimes we forget how this conflict even began. So today, we're taking a trip to the past to understand the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Josiah, first, can you share with us why the start of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is important to know?
Well, I think the origins of the conflict are complicated and obviously not entirely black and white, but that's part of why it matters. Because it is contested, not just what's happened since and what people want the final outcome to be, but also how it started in the first place. It lends itself to a lot of complication, of course, but also connections to how people think about the conflict today. Each group or side of the conflict views the origin of the conflict differently, and as a result, it shapes everything from their identity, whether they consider themselves the victim or the oppressor in this scenario. It impacts their view of the conflict, whether it is just or not, and also whether certain issues are problems or not, and what the solutions may be to those problems. All these differing perspectives can be serious obstacles to peace.
Yeah.
So it's really, I think, important to understand where did this actually come from? Why do people have such different views of the conflict? And usually, if you spend a little bit of time studying it, it's because they don't understand the start of the conflict in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially for maybe some of our younger viewers, it might just seem like, oh, this is a conflict that's just always been around. And for them, yes, it has. But it's really important to understand the beginning, to understand where we got to where we are now. So I wanted to ask you, how far do we have to go back in time to find the beginning of this conflict? Really, when did it start?
Yeah, well, that can be kind of a hard question because it's sort of a tough question about where you draw a line in the sand and say this is the beginning versus this is the process of creating the conditions that led to the conflict. And you get different answers, but I think if you want to go back to the earliest that someone might pinpoint as sort of the start of this conflict, you're looking at somewhere in the 1800s. So the political Zionist movement really sort of began in the 1800s. We do have another video on that for any of our viewers who are interested. But prior to that, there was already both a Jewish and an Arab population living in the land. It was referred to by the Ottoman Empire, who was at the time in control. They referred to it as Palestine. It was referred to by other names by the Jewish population, but there was already sort of this coexistence that wasn't necessarily weird. I mean, Jewish and Arab populations living side by side, and even in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, had been true for centuries. So it wasn't weird at the time. The Arab population was certainly larger, but they were under the control of the Turkish Empire, so they themselves were operating from a position of significantly less autonomy, self-determination, much like the Jewish population was. And it was really the process of the political Zionist movement that started to suggest that there was maybe a shift in the tides of the sort of the relationship between the Arab and Jewish population. So in the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, sort of this movement of Aliyah, Jewish immigration back to Israel, you began to see both Jews moving back, but also the conflict between the local Jewish and Arab populations beginning to slightly intensify as a response to this increase in immigration.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think that the origins of this conflict really go far back as the 1800s, because I think a lot of people think 1948, which that does have a significant impact, which I'm sure, I'm sure we'll talk about later, but it goes back a lot earlier than that, which is definitely interesting. So I want to talk about now how Jewish immigration fueled this conflict.
Well, there were two primary things that happened. First, there was conflict over land and land ownership, and then there was also conflict over political ambitions, if you will. So there It is important, I think, to acknowledge that it's not just about land. It's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But of course, it starts there, and you begin to have some tensions emerging. So when the Jewish immigrants were moving back to Israel, there were various organizations, if you will, that were organizing fundraising campaigns in order to purchase plots of land where you could actually settle Jewish immigrants, because you couldn't just send them to Palestine or the Ottoman Empire and say, figure it out.
Yeah.
You had to have somewhere to receive them, somewhere for them to go, settle, make farms, that kind of thing. In many cases, that's what they did, is they established these, actually many of them socialist agricultural communities, where they began to settle the land, cultivate it, and that sort of thing. From a Jewish perspective, this was done in a fairly straightforward and appropriate manner, because what they did was that they organized funds, they raised funds, they purchased land from different landowners, and then they transferred the deeds, titles to the land to these different communities that were going to build these kibbutzim, or agricultural communities. From a local Arab perspective, it was a very painful process, however.
Yeah.
Because many of them didn't actually own the land. And this is something that, it dates back for centuries, really. Under the Ottoman Empire, many Arab farmers or individuals who lived on land didn't actually own it. It was a very feudal system in which they rented land from landowners who lived somewhere else, most of them Turkish or Ottoman, and then they farmed it themselves. So what wound up happening was that these absentee landowners would sell land to these Jewish farmers, who would then arrive with the deed and the title, and then they would say, okay, we're going to start farming this land. And the Arab land, not even owners, but Arab farmers, if you will, were then evicted from these properties that they didn't own, but they had been farming for generations in some cases. So there was a lot of conflict over how do these Jews get the right to the land, and should they be farming land that we've been farming ourselves for generations? And it created a lot of tensions between the local Arab and the local Jewish population over who has the right to be on specific parts of land, not the land, like the land of Palestine, but specific parcels of land. The second thing that came up was, as these specific parcels of land and their purchases started to generate more controversy, there was also conflict over political ambitions regarding what was going to happen to the land as a whole, if you will. Both the Jewish and the Arab population were gradually becoming more suspicious of the other's intentions, because both of them had some claim for or quest for self-determination already. They were already kind of moving in that direction, but it was hard to accomplish both at the same time, both Jewish and Arab self-determination. The Jewish population suspected that the Arabs, in an attempt to advance their own self-determination and autonomy, including from the Ottoman Empire, were rejecting not just a Jewish presence in the territory, but also their right to create their own state, their own autonomy. The Arab population, they suspected that the Jews were not just going to evict a few farmers, but maybe even the entirety of the Arab community in order to create a Jewish state. So there was a lot of worst case scenarios playing out in people's minds, and fears growing, and it became a really pretty fraught situation over time.
So you talked about how there was some, at first, conflict between the land, different agricultural endeavors, conflict over specific plots of land, and then there started to be more political ambitions that began to get involved.
Right.
So when did it become clear that the Jewish and Arab political ambitions were going to be a conflict?
Pretty early. If you review primary sources from both the late 1800s, maybe say 1890s, into the 1900s, there are cases on both sides where both Jewish and Arab leaders were pretty aware of this fact that there was a collision course that was playing out before them, and eventually things were going to become very serious. Conflict would become inevitable if nothing changed. It took the international community, I think, a bit longer to realize it. So the local leadership, they understood this isn't good. There's going to be some conflict. Internationally, there was a pretty idealistic view for a while, and a lot of that had to do with the role that Great Britain played in sort of leading the international community's view of the territory and having the responsibility to figure out what they were going to do about it, and solving some of the issues regarding self-determination when they were given the British mandate after World War One. And even slightly before the British mandate, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which I'll read because I think it's good to hear in its entirety. Yeah. It states that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So this document, or this statement, which was made by the British official representing purportedly the British government in 1917, even before they had a mandate for the governance of Palestine, basically argued that we can accomplish both. We can respect the rights of the local Arab population, and we can build a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland, the land of the Bible. And that was in hindsight, it was very idealistic for them to think that it would be that easy and simple, that there didn't need to be any conflict over this issue. By 1922, the British did have a mandate from the League of Nations to govern Palestine, so it officially became their problem. And even then, even after they started to govern, for the first few years, they still seemed to be thinking pretty idealistically. There didn't need to be significant losses or compromises by either side. There didn't need to be conflict, that it was going to be easy, and realistically it just wasn't true. Like, in order to accomplish both Arab and Jewish visions for the land and for the territory, both sides were going to have to compromise.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how did these local Jewish and Arab populations respond to this and these changes?
Yeah, well, this is probably how the British finally came to realize that it was going to be much harder than they thought it was going to be, was when the populations didn't respond the way that they expected them to. So we'll start with the Jewish population. They've really focused on two priorities, one being increasing immigration, the goal being to, despite the controversy, continue to see more Jews brought back to their ancestral homeland and resettled in the land. The second being building local defense forces like the Haganah or the Irgun. We don't have a ton of time today to get into them. Maybe someday it would be fun to do videos on these because there's a lot of interesting history there. Yeah. But they were led by different factions of the Zionist movement on different ends of the spectrum in terms of sort of their intensity, perhaps their commitment to violence, things like that. The Arab population identified riots very quickly as an effective political tool. So they gradually started to unify around a man named al-Husseini. Even then, there were still some divisions in Palestinian society. It's hard to say if any one person ever truly represents all local Arabs or all Palestinians, but he was quite popular. He was close. In 1920, he helped to organize riots against the Jews in Jerusalem. He was arrested, but eventually pardoned, and then he was made sort of the mufti, the chief Muslim legal and religious scholar / authority in Jerusalem. And despite promises of peace, there was another series of riots in 1921, places like Jaffa. 1924, another set of riots in Jerusalem. In 1929, there's a serious riot in Hebron. So this became sort of a pattern in the 1920s of consistent use of these large-scale riots to accomplish some political objective.
Wow. It's really interesting to look at how both of these populations responded to these big changes. And you could argue even to this day, these populations are still dealing with the effects of these changes that happened almost 100 years ago. So what made these riots that happened in Jaffa and Jerusalem and Hebron, what made them, were they meaningful? Did they accomplish anything? To the Arab population at the time, was this something that was actually successful?
I mean, they weren't successful in resolving the conflicts, but they were successful in buying the local Arab leadership time. Because usually some pattern would unfold after most of these riots that was relatively consistent. there would be a pretty quick response to the riots, generally, which was to arrest both Arab and Jewish leaders.
Mm-hmm.
By quick, I mean, fairly soon after the riots. The response during the riots was not always very effective by the British, but once the riot was over, usually you could expect there to be a series of arrests of both Arab and Jewish leaders in the community. There would then be an investigation that followed, trying to determine what caused the riots. Usually what the British would end up doing is issuing a report that the riots were caused because the Arabs were scared of Jewish immigration and domination. Some of these really deeply held fears that we referenced earlier in this conversation. And then the British would have changed policy in some way to limit Jewish immigration, putting quotas on or restricting access for Jewish immigrants, that sort of thing. The flip side of this, while it was very effective for the Arab community in slowing down Jewish immigration, it didn't necessarily solve the conflict, because what it did on the reverse is it did enough damage to the local Jewish community that it increased international awareness of the Jewish community in the land, and also support for the Jewish community, both politically, financially, things like that. So it was perhaps a short-term gain, long-term loss for the Arab community when they engaged in these riots.
It's very interesting. So the British definitely played a significant role in the Middle East at the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at what point did the British realize that they needed a better, more long-term solution to help deal with some of the challenges that were in this region at the time?
So they probably knew as early as the 1920s, and there's some evidence that British officials were kind of back and forth on, is this really a good idea? Should we really be trying to be involved in this? Should we be landing where we are on certain policy issues? There was some debate internally as early as the 20s. In the 30s, that really started to become an issue, because it was no longer a blip on the radar. It was a decade or more of this pattern of violence, or this cycle. And so it became a pretty serious issue that was hard to ignore. In 1936, there was a major Arab revolt, which lasted for a while. I mean, it was years, honestly. So it became pretty clear that this wasn't going away. This problem that maybe you could have argued was isolated to the 1920s was not, that it was still around, and it was maybe even getting worse in the 1930s, late 1930s. And so the British then had to sort of take stock and figure out, okay, what is our opinion now on this issue? Can we still continue the status quo? Do we need to change? They should basically a mandate for a new commission. The British government gave a commission the responsibility to do an investigation and then draw up a recommendation for how are we going to solve this. And that recommendation basically was a partition plan that would divide the territory between the Jews and the Arabs in the territory. Their partition plan was really the first major partition plan to sort of come out by the international community, and this was in 1937. So it recommended that basically the British government divide the territory into three zones. You had an Arab state, you had a Jewish state, and you had a British-controlled territory, which would contain the holy sites. So it would reduce British responsibility and control significantly without totally giving it up. And also it would create two states, an Arab one and a Jewish one.
So the next partition plan, you said the first one was made in 1937. The next one wasn't made until 1947. So what took so long to get this second partition plan?
Well, first of all, the first one was just rejected, so it didn't go anywhere. And that created that definite sense of, okay, this first plan was bad, and not just bad in the eyes of the local population, but the whole notion of a partition to begin with was just not something that they were willing to consider at the time. So it was a while for the British government. It took a while basically to try again and say, okay, it's worth trying again to see if maybe this time they'll accept a partition if we draw it up a little bit differently. There was also a series of events that were happening, though. Between 1937 and 1947, when the second partition plan came out, there were a lot of things happening on the global stage. So in Europe, for example, but not just in Europe, there was a major World War. World War II happens. The British become entangled in World War II. The rest of the world is becoming entangled in World War II, not just in Europe, but also in other continents like Africa and Asia. And England's attention was very much focused on that. There wasn't a lot of time to be thinking about the problem of what to do with Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
In the area of Palestine, the Jewish paramilitary organizations we mentioned earlier offered to help the British in large part because they knew. I mean, people knew what the Germans were up to, what the Nazis were like, and what their ambitions were. So it behooved the Jewish people to support their benefactors in the land of Palestine, of course, in the fight against the Germans who were also trying to kill the Jews. And the flip side of that is the Arab population was a bit more supportive of the Nazis, actually. They were very pro-nationalism, anti-British at the time, and thought maybe the Nazis will basically help us get rid of the British. The problem we have is that we don't want the British in charge anymore. Al-Husseini was accused of pretty serious anti-Semitism, actually, and perhaps collaborating with or sharing Hitler's vision for the Jewish people to a certain degree. And it created some pretty strong tensions, of course. It only deepened the divide between the local Arab and Jewish populations, that they essentially took two different sides in World War II while still living alongside each other. After World War II, the British were just exhausted, because if you just fought a major world war, you almost lost it. It was touch and go for a bit. The Germans were just overrunning Europe. And when they returned their attention to Palestine, the situation is all of a sudden pretty terrible because you have a hostile Arab population to deal with who picked the wrong side in World War II but still hate the British. You have also a more hostile Jewish population because the British had chosen to place some pretty severe restrictions on Jewish immigration to pacify the local Arab population, despite the Holocaust. Even after the Holocaust, when you have all these refugees who have survived the Holocaust, the British wouldn't let them move to Israel. And that was a major issue for the local Jewish population. So now both the local Arab and Jewish population hate the British and are very hostile towards them and are beginning to engage in more violence against not only each other, but also the British. So basically, the British decided, okay, we're getting to a point where we're going to have to wash our hands of the situation. And the United Nations stepped in 1947. They're the ones actually who created the Second Partition Plan to try to help get the British off the hook, essentially, and move things in the right direction where there might actually be a two-state solution.
That was very interesting. It's interesting to think about what was happening in Europe during World War II and how that, in a way, kind of spilled over to what was happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating to think about how the Arab population kind of, in a way, sided with the Nazis, thinking it would have benefited them in a way. That's definitely, I think, maybe a lesser known fact about what was happening during that time. So I want to go back to the 1947 Partition Plan.
Right.
Can you give us the details of what exactly was in it and what became of it?
So it was a variation of the 1937 Partition Plan. In this case, the Jewish state would be slightly larger, both than the Arab state and slightly larger than the Jewish state would have been in 1937. So it was more territory for the Jews. Much of it was in less favorable territory, like the Negev desert. So it wasn't like it was prime real estate, but it was more land than the Arabs were going to get. The borders were a little wonky, and each territory was also partially divided. So it wasn't perfectly unified territories because you had population centers for both Jews and Arabs that were disconnected from each other, but wanted to live under either Jewish or Arab control. So it was a pretty wonky map that was drawn up in some ways. There would still be an international zone in Jerusalem and Bethlehem to protect the holy sites. This one controlled probably not by the British, but by the UN. But it's a very similar concept, like neutral third party controlling the holy sites kind of thing. And it didn't work. So the Jewish leaders accepted it. The Arab leaders rejected it and said no. In 1948, the British then finally sort of just washed their hands of it and said, okay, this is enough. We can't keep dealing with this. We're coming under attack from the local population. We have massive debts and problems to solve back home after World War II. We can't afford this problem anymore. And so it unilaterally pulled out before there was a solution and sort of left the Jews and the Arabs to solve the problem for themselves. The Jewish community knew, if that being the case, it was made clear ahead of time that was going to happen. So the Jewish community realized that they were going to be outnumbered, and they decided to basically take the initiative. So they declared independence in May of 1948. basically the day before the British left, and then the war started immediately after, the day after the Israeli War for Independence started.
So, the Israeli War for Independence, I've heard different names for this war. Can you explain a little bit about the different names for this war and what they mean?
Yeah, so I mean, Israelis often refer to the Israeli War for Independence because they won. So the name that they gave the war as a fairly positive connotation. We fought this war for independence. We gained it. We're independent. Palestinians often refer to it instead by other names like the Nakba, which is an Arabic term, which means the catastrophe, essentially. They named it that because they lost and they did not obtain a state. So the Israelis came out with a positive outcome. They won the war. They got their state. The Arabs lost the war. They did not get their state, and so they had very different views of the 1948 war. And they named it very differently because of that, so that it would remain in the collective memory of both groups a very different perspective on what the war was and what the outcome was. It is also often referred to as the Israeli-Arab War. Different reasons for this. Despite the fact that there was a local Arab nationalist movement fighting this conflict, the surrounding Arab countries were also involved. So it was more than just an Israeli-Palestinian war. It was also a war with the wider Arab neighborhood in which the new Israeli state existed. They were fighting all these countries for the most part. And many of them did not seek a Palestinian state. So it was less a war for Palestinian independence, and in some respects more sort of a war against the Arab community around them. And it was the first in a series of wars that Israel will fight against these countries. So sometimes it's referred to as the first Arab-Israeli war. In 1967, or the Six-Day War, maybe is sometimes referred to as the second Arab-Israeli war, or something like that.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think those labels do reflect the complexity of the conflict's beginnings. And by 1948, it was clear that there was at least three different agendas. You had a Jewish population trying to create a state. You had a local Arab population trying to create a state. You had a plethora of Arab countries with their own agendas trying to accomplish something else. And there were tremendous losses on both the Israeli and Palestinian side of the conflict, both of which are memorialized in the way that the war was named by both sides of the conflict. There was really no resolution to this very decades-old question about whether or not the Jews belonged in the first place. And those issues are still very much at play today. If you ask an Israeli, they'll say, of course we belong. This is our ancestral homeland. We belong here. We've come home. And if you ask a Palestinian, they'll say something very different. They'll argue that Israel is the aggressor and the Palestinians are the victims. And there'll be a lot of conflict over who's in the right, who's in the wrong. What is justice? Does justice even matter when trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Who has what rights? And it's a very complicated issue. Again, I think hopefully it's a little bit easier to see, even again, just based on the way that the wars are named and the way that the two sides remember the war. Hopefully it's a little bit easier to see the role that it's played in helping the conflict last as long as it has.
Yeah. And I think that really just highlights why it's so important to understand the history of these wars and the history of this conflict. Because just one example that we talked about today, the 1948 War of Independence. Yeah. You think about how even today that is seen in Israeli society. Like the anniversary of the 1948 war is like a celebration. It's seen as a triumph more in the Israeli side. For the Palestinian side, it's seen as a day of mourning. Like that is
it's Nakba Day.
Yeah, and it's even just that it shows how complicated this is and how each community has a different story to tell. They each believe a different side of what happened. So just that alone is a wonderful example of why it's important to truly understand how these conflicts began so we can understand how they're going to move forward and understand the current context of what's happening right now. So Josiah, as always, thank you for sharing your insight and knowledge on this. And to our viewers, Thank you for watching this episode. If you have any questions about what we discussed today, leave us a comment below and we would love to answer your questions. Also, check out the description for some more resources that might be helpful for you in understanding these issues. If you want to learn more about Passages, check out our Instagram, and you can also find more content related to Israel and the Middle East there as well. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.